Good evening. Hello. Thank you for being here. My name is Jennifer Robson. I am an associate professor of political management and the program director of the graduate program in political management here at Carleton. It is my job to welcome you here this evening to our lecture, the DCL lecture series on The Ghost and the Machine, the panel discussion on the future of AI in government and politics. I would like to welcome those who are also joining us online. It's a terrific turnout here in the room. Thank you for making the trek to campus. And for those of you who have logged in online, we're glad to have you joining us as well. Part of my responsibilities in welcoming you here are to remind us all in this room that we are here at Carleton on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe. I learned earlier this year, because I was looking it up, I wanted to, as a researcher, I wanted to find out a bit more. This land was actually part of the Crawford Purchase of 1783, which was a negotiated purchase of land between a British Army captain and the chief of the Mississauga. It's actually one of the largest purchases of land in North America, even to this day. It's not a treaty. There was no ongoing obligation of the Crown to the peoples of this land, just a list of goods that had to be transferred one time once. You'll notice as well, of course, it was an agreement reached with the Mississauga. And in fact, the Algonquin and Anishinaabe did not receive lands of their own in this region until well into the 19th century. So when we're here for an event on politics and on the future of politics and government, probably not a bad idea for us to pause for a moment and appreciate the fact that we are a complex country who have been formed through treaties, through the exercise of colonial power, including power over unceded and traditional lands. And so part of that is about reflecting on who we are, who we've been, and sometimes that challenging and uneasy work of reconciliation so that we can chart a new path forward together for the kind of country that we want to be, especially in these turbulent times. I'd also like to say a couple of thank yous before we get underway. First of all, obviously, a big thank you to the team at the Douglas Caldwell-Leighton Foundation, and in particular, Max Blair, who is here this evening and is also a graduate of the MPM program. Lovely to see you again, Max. And also, Casey LaRocque, who has just been a stellar partner in helping us to organize this. I'd like to say thank you as well to the Carleton student volunteers who have been here tonight, and also, of course, the campus staff who are supporting this event this evening. I have a very special thank you, though, for one person in particular, and that is Cora St. Pierre Jones, who is the graduate administrator in MPM. If this event is happening at all, it is because of her professionalism, her organizational skill. So thank you, Cora, for everything that you do. While I'm up here talking about professionalism, let me just mention that, in fact, the political management program has an information session happening next week on November 26th. Further information is available on our website and socials. So if you are an early career person interested in working in or around politics, if you have an early career person perhaps sleeping on a couch that you would like to improve their skill and employability, please encourage them to come and see us. Again, as I said, November 26th. And now it is my distinct pleasure to invite to the stage our event partner, the Executive Director of the DCL Foundation, Mr. Josh Bizak. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and thanks so much to the MPM program here at Carleton University. Friends, thank you for being here tonight. It's my absolute pleasure to be here representing the Douglas Caldwell-Leighton Foundation. I bring greetings to all of you and to all of you at home. I believe we have a few hundred visitors joining us online tonight. The Douglas Caldwell-Leighton Foundation was established by Tommy Douglas over half a century ago. Not too long ago, I was asked to come and help revitalize this charity to help fulfill Tommy's complete vision for what this organization should become. In the letter's patent, it expressly states that we are to educate the public on politics, government, and civic responsibility. And tonight, what we're doing together is exactly that. It's important also for us to remember that in these conversations, we're going to hear from people who have different opinions, because it's important for all of us to be well educated and informed as we develop our opinions on different topics. Tonight, under the theme Ghosts in the Machine, the Political Future of AI, it would be important for me to mention that the artificial intelligence issue has been top of mind for our members and supporters across this country. In fact, it's the #1 issue that I receive correspondence on. So it's only fitting that tonight, as we wrap up our lecture series year with this final event, that we delve into this topic. And I think that all of us will be better informed about what the future holds for artificial intelligence, our lives, and our communities. So with that, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing one of my very good friends, David Coletto, CEO of Abacus Data, to provide us on current opinion polling on the temperature of Canadians as they reflect on AI and what it means in their lives and their careers. So without further ado, David Coletto.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Josh, and thank you to the Douglas Caldwell Leighton Foundation for hosting this and bringing us all together. Wow, look at this room. For all those of you who know me, know that I love Carleton University, so it's always great to be back and sharing some data with you tonight. For those of you who don't know what I do for a living, I like to say that I have this really great job. I get to ask thousands of Canadians hundreds of questions every single week on you name it, I get to do it. And because I own the company, I get to really ask anything I want, which is incredibly fun. Before I get into AI and set the stage for what is going to be a fascinating panel discussion, I want to just sort of level set of where the public is, because I think to understand where the public is today and then think about what AI, both as a political tool, as a social tool, as a technology, as something that is already starting to both change and disrupt the labor market, is to situate that in that broader mindset. And I'll just quickly take you through a little bit of what's changed. And if any of you have lived through this world like I have, and I know you all have, it's not surprising to think that the public is not in a particularly good mood at the moment, right? If you think about the last 5 years and what the entire world has gone through from the pandemic and on, it's not surprising that, I always say this, in 2022, the Collins Dictionary word of the year was permacrisis, which they defined as an extended period of instability and insecurity. And so as we think about 2023 and 2024, and now we're almost done 2025, it feels like that permacrisis has continued, and it truly is permanent in a way, and how people think about it. Now, in the Canadian context, you take 3 other factors: rapid population growth, an aging population, and a housing affordability crisis. And what you saw coming out of the pandemic was largely a mindset that we defined at Abacus as scarcity, right? And I think I've gone way too fast. And that scarcity mindset, that scarcity mindset was fundamentally about the idea that people felt the things they need in their life were hard to get, too expensive, and if they had them, they were going to lose them. And that was the prevailing view up until pretty much the end of last year. I gave away the punchline. Because everywhere I was going, I was saying to audiences like you, let's get ready for a change in government. Pierre Poilievre, the Conservatives, are going to win a massive majority. And unless something fundamentally changes, that's likely going to be the outcome. You now all know the outcome. And what happened after the election of Donald Trump in that interlude at Mar-a-Lago and then after his inauguration was something that was, I think, unique to Canada. The world also reacted to it. But in the Canadian context, the debate about the 51st state, tariffs, and the rupture, in many ways, of the relationship that Canadians had with the U.S. set in motion a rapid shift in the mindset of the public, from scarcity to something I now describe as precarity. Think precariousness. And at its core, a precarity mindset is different from scarcity in that instead of people focused on the micro things in their life, cost of living, access to healthcare, access to housing, it became much more macro to them, right? It became a fundamental sense of that the structures in people's lives were no longer available. And I'll give you an example. In all of our surveys we do every 2 weeks, early in the survey, we asked Canadians, what's likely keeping you up at night? And 2 weeks ago, when you asked that question, this is the word cloud that emerges out of that open-ended question, okay? And so the story is very much one of Trump and tariffs, but also war, the economy, these macro things that are much different than the word cloud that I would have showed you from most of 2022, 23, and 24. And underneath that, two important factors remain. First, 2 out of 3 Canadians say they're worried about affording the basics over the next 6 months. And similar proportions say, look, I'm delaying major life events, whether it's retirement, whether it's maybe starting a family, maybe it's moving to a different part of the country to start a new job because of the uncertainty that this moment has created. And when you dig deeper and you ask Canadians, what are the top 3 issues facing the country at the moment, most recent survey has still the cost of living very much at the top, which is now driven not just by the price of things, but also by the fear of not being able to afford them because my income might be affected, either because I lose my job or my investments might decline or my retirement savings might be at risk. And when you look at the other issues, Donald Trump, the economy, housing, healthcare, immigration, all of those still come tied to that scarcity idea, but much more broader in precarity. Now, when you divide this country in half based on age, and you look at those over 45 and those under 45, this is what the chart looks like. And the way to read this is those issues at the top, housing, job security and unemployment, and immigration are issues in which younger Canadians are more likely to put in their top 3 issues. And then the ones at the bottom, Trump, healthcare, the economy, are issues in which older Canadians are more likely to see. And if you actually break out the 18 to 30 group and the 60 plus, you get an even wider generational divide. And so this underpinning of the generational differences in the priorities is the context for which our conversation around AI, in particular its role in politics, is going to play. And so scarcity, in my mind, is about short-term survival, where precarity is now about long-term uncertainty. When I think about what the question fundamentally Canadians were asking for the previous 3 years, it was about, will there be enough? Today they're asking, will we be okay? And so I ask you, as we have this conversation, whether it be about the role that AI might play in the information ecosystem, whether it may the role it plays in defense and security, the role it might play in the labor market, is to think of that question, will we be okay? And I'm always come back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I use this chart everywhere I go, this pyramid, and I say, unless you can deal with those issues near the bottom of the pyramid, you're not going to be able to get to the top, right? And there's a utopian version of AI that says, well, those bottom things are going to just be taken care of, and so we'll all be able to enjoy, music and culture and do all the things that we love. And yet, when you ask Canadians today, where are you most focused on, right? You test this pyramid, this is the distribution of where they are today, right? 70% of Canadians say they are still focused almost entirely on those bottom 2 rungs, right? Just over a quarter say, I'm just trying to survive, trying to pay the rent or the mortgage, trying to feed my family. The next 4 in 10 are saying, I just want sense of security, whether in person because of fears around crime or public safety, or whether it be financial. And so it's this context that then we ask the question, so what do Canadians think about AI? And I have a little bit of data, and I become incredibly obsessed with this topic, not just because of the tool that I now have to play around with and its role in data analysis and making me sound and maybe actually be smarter, but more importantly, its role in changing society, right? In getting people to think about it. And I always think that politics fundamentally is about supply and demand, like any market. The supply is what the politicians and government deliver. The demand is what the voters want and ask of them. And so when you look at AI, the reaction at this moment is quite nuanced. So for example, when you ask people, how frequently do you use these tools? Right now, about half of Canadians say they use AI, they believe they use AI, at least occasionally, right? But look at the difference. If you're under 30, it's almost up to 3 and 4. Students studying right now, there's classes going on right now, ask a professor and they're deeply worried about how their students are using AI to augment their work at any given moment. And so there's widespread use already, and I think this is moving so quickly that this survey was done earlier this fall that even today I think that number moves up every single day. Adoption is much faster than anything that I think we've seen before. Now, on the question of trust, despite the widespread use, trust is still quite low. Only 8% of Canadians say they have a very high level of trust in AI generally. And more importantly, its use in a safe and responsible way in society, you've got most people actually quite distrusting. And here you do see an interesting generational divide. If you're slightly older, you are deeply distrusting of AI, which is typical of older generations as change comes. They're always resistant, generally speaking. But even among younger people, there isn't this widespread open arm, bring it, let's accept it. There is some hesitation. Now, part of that is because half of us don't really understand anything about it, right? When we ask them to just admit, we're not actually testing their familiarity. We just say, how familiar are you? So you can imagine that people generally over-report how much they know something. So even already, if half are saying, I don't know very much about it, it's likely even more. And so we have this interesting moment where things are happening so quickly, change is moving at such a rapid pace, and yet people aren't that aware of what's going on. And so then we want to understand what are the perceptions around both the benefits and the risks around AI. And so we gave people a really long list, and we said, what do you think are the top 3 benefits? And this was the list. And the first thing that points out is there's no one clear, overwhelming item that people say, aha, that is the thing that AI is going to solve. People see increased efficiency, reduced human error, better access to information and education, more convenience in life, improved healthcare and medical advances, and the last on that list there, I don't see any benefit, which is 1 in 4 Canadians. So keep that in mind. 1 in 4 say, I see no benefit to this technology at all. Now, the concerns are much higher, though. And here you see, again, not one item standing out, but you see a mix of things. And I think this is where our conversation will go, both the upsides and the downsides around AI being used for malicious purposes, the spread of misinformation or fake content, the loss of privacy. Those 3 are more likely to be identified as the fears. And I find that interesting because a lot of the conversation more broadly is about employment loss, yet that doesn't show up until about number 5 on the list, increased unemployment or job loss. And so you can see this mix of lack of clarity on what the problem is and a lack of focus on what the upside is makes this issue very complex. But when I think about that precarity mindset that I described earlier, I want us to end with this idea that I'm very skeptical that the public is being brought along. Because already, despite the lack of familiarity, when we ask Canadians, when you hear a politician, let's say Mark Carney, and I don't say that, but let's imagine, because he's been talking a lot like this, and we're going to unleash AI into the economy. Do you think that's going to be good for you, or is that going to be bad for you, right? Right now, only 17% of Canadians think that will be good for them. More than double say that that will be bad, and the rest say, I don't know yet, which means that public opinion is still very much forming over what they perceive and hear and understand the reality to be. But when it comes to employment, which is, I think, the biggest risk in terms of the creation and the potential creation of a public backlash to this technology, is already most Canadians believe that AI will eliminate more jobs than it creates. And I leave this headline here. We were talking about it at dinner prior. This came out in September as Loblaw, the largest retailer in the country, announced it was expanding its driverless fleet pilot program by 50 trucks. Now, that's just 50 additional trucks on the road that won't have somebody driving them, earning a living. But the question that I ask is, what happens when more companies replace humans with machines? What happens when machines are talking to us during a campaign? What happens when every publicly traded company in their quarterly results, and the best time that CEOs are honest is in those quarterly reports, frankly, because they want their investors to know what they're doing. And so we're already starting to see evidence of large employers saying we're eliminating 4,000, 5,000 jobs from our workforce, not because we need to cut costs, but because, frankly, we don't need these people anymore. And what's the result? Stock price goes through the roof. And so what happens when that happens over and over and over again. That leads me to my final point, which is this broader precarity mindset that was initiated by Donald Trump is actually going to be fueled by other issues: climate change, AI, global conflict, and general instability, and therefore the reaction and response and the demand by people will be for reassurance. And so I think we've entered this age. And so as we talk about AI, as we implement it, as we think about its purpose, its focus, its utility, I think ultimately, in order to bring the public along, they need to feel reassured that their safety, their future, and that stability that they so crave at this moment will sustain itself. So on that happy note, thank you for listening. I'm going to invite Josh back up to welcome the panel and have a great rest of the evening. Thank you.
Wow, David, thanks for framing that. I think you have a lot of us more worried than when we first got here. It was excellent. Really well done. Really well done. That data is extremely interesting. We all know coming into this room tonight, in fact, we're here tonight because we feel this way, those data points. We're concerned. People don't know what AI can do, will do, and how it's going to impact us. And it's really telling when you see those kinds of numbers. People are afraid, and they don't even know what they're afraid for. And so I once again, it really stresses the importance of these kinds of moments, which is why in partnership with Carleton and the MPM program, we took a lot of care this summer putting together this wonderful panel and making sure that David could be here and that all of you could be here and online with us. So to really bring it all together now, we have a panel of experts from different walks of life, different workplaces, different career paths and agendas, and opinions on the future of AI. And I could think of no one better than one of Canada's most beloved journalists and everybody's friend from the CBC, Aaron Weary, to join us as our moderator tonight. So without further ado, please, a round of applause for our moderator, Aaron Weary.
All right, hopefully my mic is on. Let me introduce our panelists, the actual experts here. Sean O'Reilly is the president of the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada and a former federal public servant working in IT innovation. As president, he leads the largest union in Canada representing government scientists and professionals. Jordan Likeness is a longtime NDP political strategist with 2 decades of experience in civil society and campaigns at the federal, provincial, and municipal levels. She's also the Canada Director for the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, an international progressive political foundation based in Germany. Amanda Clark is an associate professor here at Carleton, specifically the University School of Public Policy and Administration. Her research examines digital era public administration, public data governance, and the political economy of digital government. Jonathan Barry is an advisor on international AI policy at MILA, Quebec's AI Institute. His work focuses on the intersection of policy and AI governance and safety, and he has been part of multilateral efforts on AI at organizations like the UN and the World Economic Forum. And last but not least, Kevin Chan is Global Director and Head of Public Policy at Meta, where he's leading Meta's efforts on global adoption of open source AI in the public sector. He is a Technology and Democracy Fellow at Harvard, a governor of Ontario Tech University, and was a visiting fellow here at Carleton in the Political Management program. So I told Jonathan this about 10 minutes ago, that I was going to go to him first, so hopefully he's come up with an answer. Just to set the table, because there is so much that kind of gets lumped into what is AI at this point. As someone recently said, everything is computer now. How would you define AI? When you talk about AI, what are you talking about?
So when you came to me 10 minutes ago and said that you were going to ask me this question, I was super dismayed because there really are as many definitions of AI as there are people who work in AI. It is notoriously tough to define. For me, I'm a policy person. I'm not a technical person. And the way that I think about it usually is, it is a branch of computer science dedicated to trying to figure out what are the tasks that it can complete that humans usually do. Now, sometimes it does that by mimicking the way that humans think. But I really want to make a pretty clear bifurcation between two types of AI. One is one called narrow AI. That's the type of AI that you can think of that does things like does chess matches, it does the T9 on your phone if you remember, and like autocorrect. That's a very specific single task. The AI that we're talking about usually, and we'll mostly talk about on this panel, is general purpose AI. So these are the things that have come out like ChatGPT, Gemini, and Llama, these big models that really can try to do everything. Now, they're not very good at chess right now, but they can do a lot of different types of tasks. And I think the reason why it's so important to think about these definitions is because, when we listen to David's data, there's a lot of uncertainty out there about what AI is. And this results in some downsides with the way that we're able to govern it and think about it from a policy perspective, is that when we talk to a policymaker, they think, this is kind of inevitable. I'm reactive to this because I don't understand this technology very well. Well, look, I work for a guy named Yoshua Bengio, who is the most cited scientist of all time, one of the godfathers of AI. And the secret is that he does not fully understand this technology either. So if there's one thing I can leave you with tonight, is that this type of uncertainty is something that we have to overcome as a society to try to bridge that kind of fear gap with, well, what are we actually doing about it? We have an opportunity to shape this technology, and it doesn't require understanding every little piece of it.
Kevin, does that fit with what you would sort of consider AI at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to build on that, you're talking about, I think, two tracks. So you got this classical AI, which is like sort of things you described, but also like if you're online, like Netflix, right? So like the algorithm that powers that's based on your preferences, that's like classical AI. And then I think the one that has really captured people's imagination in the last few years is this generative AI, which is like it's actually generating new content or predicting sort of like what the next sequence of words will be. And that is much more human-like. And I think that's really what's captured people's imagination. There's probably a lot of interesting use cases coming out of that, but I think also because it seemingly approximates how humans think and behave and interact, I think that's really really ushered in a new age of technology. And if you believe, sort of many of the people who are pro this stuff talking about, basically a new industrial revolution. So it's exciting, but I also think there's also a lot of questions that we should be unpacking.
So to start that unpacking, predictions are dangerous and generally not worth much. But looking, let's say 5 years in the future, and we'll sort of go down the line, how do you see, I guess there's two ways to answer this question. One is, where do you see AI being used, or how do you see it being used in government and political offices? Or alternatively, what do you think is the biggest risk or need for caution in how it's used in government and political offices? Sean, if you want to start.
Yeah, no, just to go back to what was said previously, for a risk perspective, I think the concern I have is, that not a lot of people know about how AI is being used in general in government, in society, and I think that issue there rests with the federal government in the sense that, they've talked about an AI registry, and we yet to have seen one. There is some ones out there, a few educational institutions have set them up, but there's no central repository. The thing is, too, is that we as Canadians do not know how it's being used. I am, from a public service perspective, there's a lack of regulation. And I think it's important that the fact there's nothing there, I feel that Canada is actually behind the times, because I think with regulation, we'd have a better understanding as Canadians what exactly is in there, how it's being used. Because I have concerns because, when we type stuff into ChatGPT, I did it yesterday. I was working on an email. I said, I got to write this sentence better. So I wrote it in there, but then I'm thinking, okay, I got to be careful. Can't put too much detail in there. someone in California is going to look at this in 3 years and judge me on what I said in that email. And so that's a real concern I have, is how is that data being used? And that's the risk I see. And I see within the federal public service, we represent data scientists, IT professionals, and they're working on it every day. But it's not clear how Canadians are going to interact with the federal government when it comes to AI. And I think as a Canadian, and definitely as a public servant, that gives me a bit of pause. Jordan?
So I think it's interesting doing a bit of work in Europe. You get a slightly different perspective, because the conversations in Europe have tended towards regulation much faster than they have here in North America. So last year, Europe passed the first comprehensive AI regulation legislation that's going to be gradually brought in over the next few years. But it's interesting, like even there, the regulation is very consumer focused. And the question of work and AI and managing some of those impacts and some of the things that Sean was talking about hasn't been as central to that conversation yet. And a lot of the concern has shifted towards questions of competitiveness. And we're seeing a little bit of a replication of that conversation, I think, here in Canada, particularly as this government's trying to bring in more of an innovation approach rather than a regulatory one on AI. But I would say, more generally, if we look ahead 5 years from now, and the German Ministry of Labor has actually done this. They have people who sit there and forecast what's work going to look like in 5 years. And their belief is that there is no profession that won't be touched by AI within the next 5 years. It's already here. It's already a part of our work. It's a part of our lives, and it's here to stay, and that's only going to deepen. But I would say that when we look ahead, I think in the next 5 years, what we're going to see is conversations that will focus less on is AI good or bad, and more on questions of how it can be responsibly managed, how sort of human control can be really made central to it, questions of governance and transparency. So, going a little bit to Sean's point there, do citizens know when AI is being used by their government? Do they know what it's being used for? And so those are questions I think that are going to come to the fore. And there are some interesting models that we can look at in Europe to put into the conversation here. But, with respect to the political space, we're already seeing it in campaigns. We don't even have to look into the future. We can look into the past cycle in the US to see some of the first large-scale adoption of AI in a campaign context. You have it everything from, we know like lots of political staffers are just dumping things into ChatGPT and getting it to do things. Please don't do that.
Please don't do that.
But, they are. But there's also now a lot of tailor-made tools that campaigns can buy. And then we've also seen things that are more high profile in the space of, for example, AI-generated video. So we've seen, and images. We've seen Trump, we've seen Ron DeSantis, we've seen the RNC use these things, and only sometimes with disclaimers about things that are AI-generated. And so then we also enter into questions of things like deepfakes and disinformation and the role that AI can play in really accelerating the spread of those. But also potentially in identifying and controlling the spread of those things. So there's not really, I think, one answer in terms of whether it's going to be positive or negative, but rather two sides to the coin as we look and see how this is being picked up in those spheres.
I know.
Yeah, I'll narrow my comments on the kind of use of AI in the public sector. And I think in that context, some of the sort of doomsday scenarios are already here. Like you can find numerous examples of truly harmful applications of AI in the public sector, whether you're looking at how the Dutch governments and the Australian governments have tried to automate tax fraud detection, leading to sort of false accusations of tax fraud and financially ruining people, leading to suicides and like genuine human harm. And of course, classically disproportionately targeting racialized people and those who are already marginalized by the state based on how the algorithms have been configured. Trump's Doge gang have tried to use AI to analyze financial data, leading to billions of dollars in errors. I think, we have to be pretty aware that the public sector has not historically been very good at implementing technology, right? And we've been, understatement. And we've also been seriously underinvesting in the kind of digital capacity and literacy within the public sector. So when I read the kind of breathless enthusiasm with which AI is described as a kind of necessary solution for the kind of deep governance issues that are facing our public sector, I'm hugely skeptical and deeply concerned that we're going to have one of these very harmful outcomes in the Canadian case. So we should all be really holding the government to account to ask, like, where are the guardrails? And all the public opinion research not only shows that individuals are deeply afraid of AI and its harms, but also that they really want a strong role for the state to regulate AI, both in terms of how it uses it and how private sector uses it. And that's true across a whole range of studies. Studies in China, studies in the UK, studies in Canada show that people want law and regulation. They are not in favor of free rein innovation.
I think that's a really important point, particularly on the Netherlands. You know, I used to be a political staffer, and that government fell because they didn't fully understand the type of algorithms that they were using, which led to like widespread harm. And it's not just about the public service trying to adopt AI. It's actually that they have they owe citizens a lot more. There's a higher risk when they deploy these technologies. If you'll indulge me, I'll tell a quick story. Imagine you're an engineer sitting in a corner office. You're working for one of the big AI companies. And as usual, you're testing a bunch of models and you want to move on to the next one. This company has adopted their own model. They have like let it suffuse through their emails and their file system and all this sort of thing. It's coming to the end of the week. You're working late as usual. At 6 p.m., you send an email to the rest of the engineering team saying, okay, we're going to shut this model down and we'll start up the next one next week. Instantly, the engineer receives an email back saying, if you do this, there will be consequences. Now, the engineer had been doing something he shouldn't have been doing. He was having an affair with one of his employees. And the AI could tell through the emails that this was happening. Immediately, what the AI said was, if you do this, if you shut me down, I am going to tell the board, and I'm going to tell your wife. Now, this sounds like science fiction. But this is the type of behavior that we've seen with all of the major models in the labs right now. And the reason why I bring this up is not to try to scare you, but it's to say that one thing, is that we are not going to be able to effectively adopt AI until we're able to trust it. You're not going to hire someone who's willing to blackmail you or is willing to give you false information that we see with hallucinations. It's not going to work. We really have to think about how we do this responsibly. And for governments, you know, there's a lot of big talk about bringing particularly generative AI into the way that we govern. I think there's a huge amount of risk with that, but we have a choice. We can shape the technology to be a lot more trustworthy and get the benefits from it.
Kevin?
Yeah, I think I'm going to be more pedestrian about my examples. I think, so I used to be a public servant many, many years ago, and if you're a public servant and you're kind of in the policy function, you'll know that you just write a lot of briefing notes. In fact, maybe students here are kind of preparing to get into that world where you're writing briefing notes. That takes up a lot of time. And actually, I recall, like, I used to work with this kind of like I've worked closely with this deputy minister, and he's kind of done all the departments. And he used to say to me, you know, the one thing I worry about, Kevin, is not that we don't have the right advice for the prime minister. What I worry about is I don't have enough people to write the notes in a way that's like clear enough to get it to the PM in a timely fashion. And I think, like, for me, what's interesting is that AI, and indeed actually the public service of Canada has these kinds of, they're experimenting with these kinds of bots, are able to actually do things like refine briefing notes, so that you don't, you know, you're just not up to the analyst. If you hire an analyst that can't write, you're like in big trouble, right? Even if they're really smart. And now you're actually going to be able to, and they are actually playing with chatbots that are kind of trained to understand sort of government lingo, understand the policy issues and the regulations in place, and help craft better briefing notes. And so this is like a low-hanging fruit thing. I don't know how many millions of dollars that'll save. But I think there are kind of more practical ways in which public servants and the government can benefit from efficiencies. I don't know if that's sort of the type of stuff they imagined in what was announced in the budget. Maybe not. But I do think that there's like a lot of low-hanging fruit where you can kind of help empower a lot of public servants to do things using pretty basic tools that are actually kind of free right now to use.
So you mentioned the budget. By my count, I think there were about 9 departments, if you go back to, I think it's like Annex 3, that goes through the expenditure review for each department. And I believe there are 9 different departments CRA, CRTC, Finance, StatsCan, Justice, Public Safety, Public Services, Shared Services, and the regional development agencies that identify AI explicitly as something that is part of the way they're going to save money. I guess a couple things. How realistic do we think that is? And where it is realistic, what do we think it looks like? Sean, do you want to go first?
Sure, and I just want to go back on, well, if you look at AI in the public service, and, I actually agree with Kevin, I think that briefing note's a perfect example. And when it comes to using AI within the public service, the fear I have, and I'll call it a fear, because right now we don't have a lot of details. We've heard those departments, Shared Services Canada, that's actually my home department. They are the ones implementing the system, so it makes sense that the AI is going to be there. But is it going to be used to augment the public servant? Which I think that is important. I look at there are ways definitely AI can help public servants do their jobs more efficiently. But my concern is, we talked about chatbots here. You look at it was 2 years ago now, I think Air Canada, they were sued because a chatbot gave the wrong information for someone about canceling their flight. So everyone hates to get a flight canceled, but, to the doom and gloom, I don't want to go to it, but, a chatbot giving the wrong advice to a taxpayer, giving the wrong advice to, and I don't want to go to extreme cases, but, to rely on a chatbot to give advice to a Canadian, I'm worried that in the budget that they're treating AI as, this silver bullet. It's like, well, we're going to replace all these CRA call center folks with a chatbot. And, even the Auditor General said it doesn't work. And I'm worried about them trying to save money by getting rid of public servants when truly AI, if it's going to be used properly, should be augmenting the public servant to do their job more efficiently and to help Canadians more. And I think there are ways to save money there. But my concern is that they're going to use it as a silver bullet to reduce the public service, and in the sense it should be helping to make it better for Canadians. And that's the concern I have when I see that budget.
Amanda, as the person who spends a lot of time thinking about how government works, how does that line up with your thinking?
Yeah, I think the idea that we're going to find a lot of savings from AI is pretty naive. And I mean, surprisingly shallow how it's been presented from a prime minister in a government that is apparently obsessed with evidence and the kinds of briefings where you get sent on your way if you're not answering the hard questions. Where are the hard questions being asked about this tool that is sort of going to, as you say, be sort of a silver bullet? And there's classic technological solutionism going on right now, which is, sort of ignoring the kind of broader context of problems and instead identifying a tool and then sort of assuming that it can solve all these problems before you. This is the exact same rhetoric that was in play in the 80s and 90s when we first started talking about electronic government and then digital government throughout the 2000s and 2010s. Computing and the internet and applications and smartphones and social media and blockchain were all supposed to reduce the cost of the public sector, lead to massive layoffs, improve the service experience, make government more transparent, more democratic. And guess what? Punchline is none of those things happen. In fact, quite the opposite. And some of the most expensive failures in government policy history in the last few decades have been IT failures. So, I mean, it could be that in the long run, there are lots of ways we could use this technology to supplement talent and yes, to create redundancies by automating tasks. But it's going to require, I think, quite a strong short to medium term investment in cleaning up the government's data, which is a mess. Anyone who's ever worked with a government data set knows that it is not a wonderful place to start, and that there's just to say there's many issues, and that's a real understatement. So there's this piece, and then I think the second piece is the change management exercise that is involved in rolling out an AI tool across a team. And this is something that I'm hearing a lot more from the public servants I talk to, is that especially for managers, they have a new set of tasks involved in socializing the idea of AI to their staff, ensuring that they're not scaring them, getting them on board to have them think about ways they can use it to augment their work. So this is actually adding work and adding cost as well in the need to acquire very expensive data scientists and bring them into the state or contract that out. And I think this is an important piece we should keep in mind across this conversation, which is that there are many private vendors who have a huge stake in fueling this hype, which is, again, also what we saw for those previous waves of technological implementation in the state. So the lessons are there, and it's discouraging, to say the least, to see this kind of the tech goggles that have grabbed hold of us. When, if you ask me, like, how can we make the federal public sector more efficient? I would say start by cleaning up the Treasury Board policy suite. Make it easier for public servants to actually make a decision without 1,700 people showing up to a meeting. Why are so many people copied on every email? Like, there's too much hierarchy, and this has been documented in the Canadian public administration literature for decades, and yet right now we're looking at AI to solve the inefficiencies of the federal public service. It's like, feels like a Beaverton article, not an actual policy plan. So I have like some subtle thoughts on this, I would say. Yeah.
You know,
I'll put you down for undecided. Jordan, you talked about regulation and where they are in Europe. I guess a couple of things. One, my general experience is that once regulation gets talked about, people go, whoa, you're restraining creativity.
Yeah.
The second is, do we know what we're regulating at this point? From your sense of where the European conversation is, do you think there are things that the Carney government, while it's going on its kind of push for AI, what kind of regulation it could be building to put in place?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's important to note, like, the conversation in Europe, well, I think it's more advanced in some ways than what we're having here. It's also still partial, right? They're not really yet at the point where they're regulating the full sort of social and political impacts of broad-based AI adoption. So those questions remain, to be addressed, and there's a lot of contestation around that. But I think, for the government, when they're looking at this, I would share the skepticism in a big way about huge claims of savings without really any evidence or pilots that demonstrate this. And, we were just joking that Phoenix is like, Phoenix Pay System is kind of like the last example of this, right? Where we have these solutions that are brought in, a certain technology is bought off the shelf, often from a private provider at a very high price, but it's not really fit for purpose in the public service, and we end up worse off than we were before. And so I think the conversation that has not happened in Canada that needs to happen is also around job protection. So these are some of the things that Sean was talking about, because of course, AI needs to serve people rather than the other way around. But that also means making sure that broad-based training is available so that we don't develop inequities in terms of the ability to use AI within our workforce and within our public service workforce, generationally, gender-wise, there's all kinds of potential gaps there that will need to be closed proactively. But, we should also be talking about data sovereignty and security. The adoption and the pace of adoption that's being talked about in government right now is really outpacing a lot of those conversations. And already the government is contracting to US-based cloud firms where, yes, their physical infrastructure will be in Canada, but again, there's a lot of cross-border data happening here. And with the US being such an unreliable partner with an authoritarian government right now, these are questions that really have to be asked. Does it make sense for us to be building that in? And it's exactly right to say that a lot of the private providers who are bringing these services to the government have a vested interest in finding applications for it in government. And so they really shouldn't be the ones deciding where that's going to go. And I think the other thing is there's a question of public trust and accountability too. So if we're going to be having AI be involved in really important decisions that impact people's lives, so things like tax evasion or immigration decisions, for example, that's an application that we could see coming pretty quickly. What is, number one, the transparency on that? Are Canadians aware of where algorithmic management is being used in their interface with government? What is their appeal process? Do they have a way to understand how a decision was made and to appeal it to an actual human? And what is the human oversight there to make sure that those errors are not causing real harm? And a challenge, I would say, and that's a polite word for it, is that we have a government who is wanting to move so quickly. And so you saw maybe Minister Solomon out over the summer talking about a 30-day sprint to update Canada's AI plan and framework. Well, that's not enough time to have a real conversation about all of these things. And so the idea that somehow there is an ability for the government to meaningfully move ahead in an innovation space, but not address the regulatory and governance side of this, I think does not serve Canadians well and could actually lead us into some pretty bad situations.
Jonathan and Kevin want in on that conversation?
Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about the sovereignty piece because I think it's so important. I mean, I think looking back in time, this will be one of the biggest missed opportunities in Canadian history. 2 of the 3 godfathers of AI are Canadian, and they've stayed in Canada. The 2 biggest AI institutes in the world are in Canada. They're the envy of the world. Mila, where I work, is 2,000 people. Vector in Toronto is similarly huge. And we've fallen behind quite a bit. This becomes a really acute issue when the only 2 countries that can field frontier AI, that means the best of the best AI, the Gemini, the Llama, these types of things, are the US and China. And to be frank, these are not reliable partners anymore. And when we talk about adopting AI, it's not just the data sovereignty, which I really think is important. It's not just data centers. It's having access to the models here in Canada that are going to drive our economic growth, that are going to allow our governments to become more efficient. Yesterday in Berlin, Chancellor Merz and President Macron announced an EU effort to try to get to frontier AI. They've woken up to this problem that they can't just rely on the US and China in the future. They have asked Canada time and time again to join this effort, and we haven't raised our hands. And I find this so odd because we have such a lead. We have the best researchers in the world. We have the right climate to be building data centers. We have all of these things, and we're not stepping up, even with this looming sovereignty threat to our north, or to our south, sorry.
Yeah, I'm happy to build on that too. I mean, I think I agree. There is kind of, we didn't talk about this yet, but there is kind of like this broader context that you're kind of hinting at, just like this, I guess it's kind of like the geopolitics of AI. So the reason why there's only really 2 countries that can build frontier AI right now is because it's really expensive. So it's highly capital intensive. It costs billions and billions of dollars per year. And every year, the goalposts get moved further out because some company will come out with a new frontier model, which will cost even more. And so like, there's kind of this race at this point. I mean, again, the paradigms could change, but right now the view is the more compute, right, the more powerful the chips and the more data you feed a model, the more performant the model will be. And that's really what we're looking at. And so at this point, if you look at the last few years, what we seem to be observing is that there are really powerful, what you've referred to as frontier models in the US, and then there's these frontier models in China. And that's really where the challenge is. And so I guess like one thing that's worth considering or thinking about is like, where can Canada succeed in this environment? So it could maybe, like to your point, maybe you're hinting at this, like connecting with other countries that are like-minded and you maybe can pool resources to try to compete at the frontier level. But another option could be also where can Canada uniquely win? And I think a lot of people have talked about, can Canada win at the kind of commercialization application layer? So there are ways where you could, in theory, have very performant models based in Canada that are not necessarily sending data elsewhere, especially sensitive data. So we talked a bit about Llama, or you made reference to Llama. Llama is an open source model that Meta has built, but there are many other open source models around the world. These open source models, they are very competitive and frontier models, but they're not housed in a cloud somewhere. You literally just download the thing. And you can actually run them on premise. And so, for example, hospitals use these open source models because they have a lot of patient data, and they don't want to be sending that patient data into the cloud, so they can run it locally. One could imagine that government data about citizens would be equally sensitive, and there's an opportunity potentially to sort of run these things locally. But that, we're talking about the application layer. We're talking about what are the valuable use cases that Canada can win on that aren't necessarily dependent on Canada reinventing, kind of the entire tech stack and producing Canadian frontier models.
So does that, I'm not the expert here, so let me make sure I understand it. Can that be, the idea you're expressing, can that be aligned with data sovereignty?
I think so.
Yeah.
In the sense, well, it depends on what, so again, data sovereignty is it depends on who you talk to and depends on what the definition is. But if you're saying, hey, listen, data sovereignty means there's some data that we wouldn't want to send elsewhere. We want to keep it in Canada. Then you could have, different AI models powering applications that this data is being, treated, to synthesize it for some use case that stays in Canada, and that Canada can actually Canadianize and call it its own.
So with that, I look at what the government of Canada has done insofar in AI, and I look at the huge contract that they've agreed to with Cohere. My fear is that, to that whole point, Cohere is supposedly a Canadian company, but they're using U.S. data centers. And to Kevin's point, I really wish that, like I said, we represent data scientists and IT professionals. I think that Canada collectively should be developing its own in-house AI. And I don't see that right now with what the investments the government of Canada has made so far. I love the idea of having something that is housed in Canada, especially for sensitive data, citizen data. Even within, as some of you are aware, sharing data between departments is almost impossible in government to protect your privacy, which makes complete sense. The thing right now is that I worry that we're going to be throwing all this data into this big mass, and it's not going to really produce. It's going to make the data sets worse. That we're dealing with. I'd rather see us building that in-house, and I'm not seeing that within the budget, within what's been put forward, that we're not building that capacity in Canada, even though we do have the expertise here.
How, on a practical level, in terms of government and the public service, I would imagine one of the top concerns, maybe the top concern, is job loss. From my very, basic understanding of artificial intelligence, one of the concerns is that it's going to eliminate entry-level jobs. And if you eliminate entry-level jobs, of course, you just make it that much harder to build a workforce. Is that a particular concern from your end?
Oh, for sure. We were even talking about it at supper tonight. So my career in the public service, I'm in IT. I got a Bachelor of Computer Science many years ago. And that's how I started. I was programming in Visual Basic, I think, when I started in the government. And, if you lose that entry level, and my fear is with AI, if you don't have those people that know the basics of it, if you rely everything to AI and AI is doing all the work going forward, who's actually the one that's making sure that is checking the AI? We talked about augmentation earlier, but, who's making sure the machine isn't making decisions for you that you have no control over? So when you've got rid of all these entry-level positions, the base data, I studied Turing machines and artificial intelligence in university, and I have a basic understanding of it. But if we erode that entry level, basically we're going to rely on the AI, and we're going to hope it's right. And there's a movie out there, I don't know if you've seen it, it's called Idiocracy. And basically AI is controlling everything, and basically, there's no real checks and balances. Basically, AI is smart, it takes care of everybody, but no one's checking what the ghost machine is doing. So
I will say, when Kevin mentioned briefing notes, I will say as a journalist, I can see it within the next 5 years as a cabinet minister going to a news conference and saying, well, it was the machine that did it.
We can't already do it with the chatbot.
Yeah, we can't really haul the machine in front of committee and yell at it. I mean, I guess we could. For Jordan and Amanda, I guess, is this the accountability piece? Is there a way, is that just going to have to be kind of developed over time, or is there a way to build that in to ensure that whatever's going on within a parliamentary democracy, an old-fashioned parliamentary democracy, we can still hold people accountable for this?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's critical, because if there's not accountability, then that situation that you describe is 100% going to happen. And look, and I think you can look across the Atlantic for some examples. So the UK has legislation that requires transparency and basically has a registry anytime algorithmic management is used in government there, so that citizens can see and understand. And there's a few reasons for that. Number one, because that's very important for public trust. But number two, that information is going to come out anyway, right? And so you can imagine a scenario in which government adoption of AI in Canada picks up. Well, people are going to want to know about it. So how will it come out? It will come out through questions on the order paper, questions in question period, access to information requests, and all of those things. So the government can make a choice to bake in kind of proactive disclosure on that on the outset, or it will come out the other way, where there can be credibility risk, really, for the government, because it does make people uncomfortable to think that it's not a real human, for example, reviewing your cousin's visa application, but rather it's a machine doing it, and there's no way to know that. So I think that there's space for it to be built in, but then that requires that governance question and direct political accountability in the old school sense up through the minister, which is a quaint notion these days, that it requires that to remain core to the ethos of how the government's approaching adoption more generally.
Yeah, and I think we can look at some recent cases of big kind of AI-driven failures and see that some traditional accountability mechanisms, you make a choice, and I don't think that the general public is just going to agree like, oh, well, the computer said no, so we're moving on here. If you look at the robo-debt case in Australia, for example, where individuals were kind of accused of committing benefits fraud. This is the largest class action payout that the government has had in its history. And ministers were raked over the coals for this, and justifiably so, right? And it may be that kind of a failure is what would lead the political class in Canada to start asking things like, why don't we have a registry? Where's the human in the loop? What are the guardrails for public servants? Because they're going to be the ones in the hot seat when a decision is made and like real human harm results. So, I mean, I hope it doesn't go that way. The smarter path would be to think about those things now. And some of that is going to be thinking about this on kind of two levels. Like, one is what do sort of the experts in governance surrounding these technologies say leads to the, outcomes that are in line with procedural fairness and equity and justice and transparency. And then there's also what the public believes leads to those outcomes, and those aren't always the same. You have to kind of satisfy them. I'm not saying we need a royal commission or anything, but I do think that we are at this pivotal moment where we want to ask, like, as a country, what do we want our government to look like in an age of automated decision-making and mass data-driven, algorithmically designed systems? And it's not always obvious. People often pull out transparency or answerability, and this will appease people. Again, the research shows actually when you ask individuals what leads them to trust an AI system, they say, I want to know that someone is held accountable for it. I want to know that someone who is politically responsible for this algorithm. That is what they turn to. It's like classic mechanisms of political accountability come into play. That kind of research across Canada is something that we need to do now so that we can have a good understanding of what do we need to do to not break the social contract when we use these tools? Because I mean, that's what's really at stake here, right? Is a kind of a further eroding trust in government.
Kevin, you wanted to jump in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to sort of, I think, talk about like augmentation or complementing humans in a slightly different way, but I agree, I think, with what's being said. But I can give you like two concrete examples of where like AI can be helpful, but it's certainly not meant to replace sort of the work, right? So like one is like, there are lots of hospitals in the US now that are actually using generative models to help look over the work, like I say MRI scans. Usually you have a clinician who's kind of looking at it and sort of trying to diagnose something. Some hospitals now are actually using generative models to do a check on the diagnosis, and it's not as if. But it's not that the AI then says, actually you do have a problem or you don't. It's more saying, it looks like based on the review that you may have missed the following thing. And it's always the clinician that has to look at it and see whether or not they want to change their mind or if this is new information that they have to factor in. So I think that's an example of how it is kind of a governmental type role where you're using sensitive data. You're never using it to make a decision, but you are helping enhance what a professional, right, is supposed to do, and they make the call. They make the final call, but there's a way to have an AI help check that. So that's one example. The one on transparency that I really like, it's like, so in a university setting, close to home. So this past weekend, I was with the Rhodes Selection Committee to go through these applications for the Rhodes Scholarship. And interestingly, the way the Rhodes Trust has implemented AI, or rather, they know that students are going to use AI for their applications. And so, but then the way they do it is they don't say, okay, you can't use it, or you should use it. They actually have a field that says, if you did use Gen AI, tell us how you did it and what you did. And of course, anybody who says, oh, I use generative AI to write my thing from scratch, you're not going to get to the finals, right? You're not going to get the scholarship. And whereas someone who says, well, I used it to help, I wrote something, I used it to help clean up my grammar, keep it under the word limit. I've seen those, they have to explain, and I think that was actually a way at transparency. It was a way to get people to be honest about how they're using it and be accountable. And I thought it actually worked pretty well because people, once you're asked a question, no one's going to be like, oh yeah, I'm going to totally try to get away with generating an entire essay. And I thought that was, at first I was like, I'm not sure if that's going to work. But when you go through 50 some applications, you're like, you know what? The transparency that's built in does help augment the final product, if you will. But it actually was, I think, beneficial.
Which presumably makes the case for the government to be even more transparent than people applying for Rhodes scholarships.
Oh, I was riffing off of the whole transparency
Yeah.
point. Yeah, absolutely.
Jonathan, is the trust piece within the AI world, not that it's a separate ecosystem or anything, but within your world, is the trust piece a key point of discussion? Are people, building on what David pointed out in his data, do people working in AI realize they have a lot of work to do to win people's trust?
Yes and no. I mean, for a long time there was this big movement for AI safety, which is now kind of a bad word. We don't say safety anymore. What we talk about is trustworthiness and reliability and control and these types of things, which are in some ways more accurate and tangible. There's a growing realization that really reliability is a capability. You can see this. There was a study in the US out of MIT in June which showed that 95% of US companies that tried to adopt generative AI failed at doing it. And then there's a ton of reasons about why that is. They chalked it up to culture, which I always think is a bit of a weak argument. Part of that is because it's hard to trust. Now, buried in this report, I think, was something really interesting, is that while 95% of the companies failed to adopt AI, 45% of their employees were successfully using ChatGPT in the workplace. And I think this is an important lesson for us. We have to understand where and how these tools should and could be used. The examples that Kevin gave us, I think, are really enlightening. This is a very thoughtful approach to how we can use AI. It's not trying to lean into the hype, take ChatGPT and use it to write every single briefing note out there. No, it's about maybe we should use it first to check the briefing notes. Maybe it's good for translation and that type of thing. But it's because we can't reach that right level of trust, and it's paired with this extreme hype. There's some real risk here to us using it in the wrong way.
You brought up the hype. I was going to bring up the hype. Because there are some studies that have pointed out, as you mentioned, that the results are a bit different than some of the hype. There was one, I'll go to the BBC because that's sort of my vocation. They did a study, AI assistants misrepresented news content 45% of the time. Is there, we've talked a lot about the Carney government's push for AI. I think some of us have already hinted that maybe it's more than the hype is exceeding what is possible. Is there a possibility here that we're 5 years from now, we're going to look back on this moment and go, well, we got a little carried away?
Yes, I think certainly. Again, I'll come back to this fundamental thing that I want to leave you with tonight, is that we have a choice. There is a world in which we'll look back and say, okay, we got carried away. We tried to use ChatGPT for our entire government and it didn't work. Or there's a reality where we did it in a really responsible, thoughtful way, where 5 years from now we'll say, okay, we made a couple mistakes. We weren't able to automate as much as we thought and save as much money as we thought. But at least, our government is still standing. There's still trust in what we're doing. I think this hype thing is really unique to what's happening in AI right now, because there's this US-China race that's happening. And this race is predicated on one thing. It is to try to raise capital as much as you can to try to keep feeding the beast, to give more compute to the model, to give more data to the model. And this leads to kind of a narrative where, okay, we can't talk about anything else. We just have to talk about scaling, because if we don't, we're going to lose to China, to big bad China. Well, the reality is that there are a lot of kind of subtle engineering things that we can do to decrease the cost of training, which means decreasing the environmental impact, to try to make these models more reflective of the ways that we use them, to educate people about the right ways that we can use them as a tool. So when I talk about trust, I don't think of it as trying to restrain innovation. I think trust is the one thing that will allow us to really adopt and innovate, particularly in government, where you need a very, very high level of trust. You owe it to your citizens.
We haven't talked a lot about politics, but you brought it up, and I spend way too much time thinking about it, too.
Occupational hazard.
Yeah. Really should have gone into law or something. We've spent a lot of time, the last couple of Democratic reform ministers, when we had Democratic reform ministers, spent a lot of time worrying about what to do about social media, and sort of 5 years, 10 years too late going, we should do something about this. Do you think, maybe even before the next election, we need to be opening the Elections Act and figuring out what to do about it in terms of AI? Or do you think, is it possible that we've got enough protections already in place that we're fine?
No. No, we don't. And I think that, we can see from other cycles that have happened recently that it's just not the case that political parties are going to self-regulate in a way that's fair and effective for this. So I think, and this comes back again to the question of transparency and accountability. You need both. And so for that, it would be wise for conversations to be happening about how to level the playing field. For example, when content is AI generated, making sure that that's indicated to people, making sure that there are clear lines of responsibility if that AI generated content is not correct or contains misinformation. We've seen in the US cases where AI generated robocalls have been used for voter suppression purposes. So they've had to legislate at the state level against that. That technology is available, and not just to political parties who have a pretty good incentive to stay within the letter of the law there, but there are malicious third parties out there. There are malicious state actors out there who also have access to these technologies, and we have to bear that in mind. I think one of the, but I don't also only want to talk about AI in political campaigns as a negative thing, because there's a lot of the concerns that I think are really very well-founded and very public. So things like deep fakes, things like really supercharging misinformation, the idea that we now have AI-powered basically personalities within social media that can interact and sort of mimic human patterns in persuasion as well. So there are a lot of studies that suggest like something as low as a 20-minute conversation with an AI chatbot can move people's political opinions. So these tools are very effective, and they can be very dangerous. But they also can improve aspects of our democracy, right? So you can imagine AI being used in ways to do really deep, broad-based public consultation at a scale that we don't really do right now, because you can take in large amounts of public comment and synthesize it. You can see that, yes, delivering services more efficiently and effectively could be an outcome of this. And also one of the other things that these tools, and not just the ones that are publicly available, but purpose-built tools for campaigns, they also level the playing field a little bit when it comes to money in politics, because smaller campaigns with fewer resources can access these tools and have a larger impact. And so there's good test cases of this out of the US when it comes to fundraising, that if you are using AI-generated content, for example, in political fundraising, first, that voters can't tell the difference. It performs equally well, but you get about a 400% greater efficiency in terms of hours for output, for dollar output in fundraising. So you can see that, in a world where we have, provinces like Ontario moving to bring more money back into the political space, that's something that could potentially be a counterbalance to that as well. So I think that there are good things and things that could strengthen democratic participation, but only if it comes with that transparency and accountability so public trust is maintained.
Kevin, did you want to say something on that?
Yeah, actually, if I may, a few things
Yes.
to build on. I think this is all right. I think to your point about the campaigns, I mean, you could actually generalize that even just to marketing or advertising generally. Like one of the biggest things that we as a company anyways found is that generative AI can be super helpful for advertisers, whether it be a political party or a small business or, I don't know, maybe a university, just create ads, creative ads. Like people used to like spend a lot of money just in the production of these things. And now largely you can just say, well, I want an image of whatever, I'm trying to advertise, this thing. And the AI can actually do a lot of that for you. So I think there are those productivity increases. Again, I don't know if we're talking about multi-million-dollar productivity gains, but it is complementing sort of what people already are trying to do and are spending a lot of time doing that may not be as value add as sort of what they could be doing. On elections, I like so transparency is important, definitely. I also think like having the right expertise within Elections Canada is kind of important. Like, I remember many years ago, so I've been around this this digital world for a while, and I remember going into I was at this retreat with the various electoral officers of the country, and then there was one CEO, like a chief electoral officer for one province, and we were talking about back when everybody was talking about online misinformation, and he said, you know what really worries me? He's like, there's all these ridings where there's all these Chinese communities. And they're exchanging information on different apps in Chinese. And he's like, I don't have anybody in my office that actually can read or understand Chinese. And it spoke to kind of the need for that kind of expertise. And so I do think I think the Canada Elections Act, I think probably has a lot of the kind of the framework necessary to deal with the challenges. It's more, do you have the expertise to think about the new ways in which interference or sort of integrity challenges may manifest itself with AI, and so you need to hire people who have those expertise. And then the last thing, if I may say, is just, I just want to make sure that while we're talking about sort of the hype and maybe some of the risks, I think it's also important though on a theoretical level, to provide that framework of I think what we may be on the cusp of is this is a general purpose technology. So it actually is a bit like, and I was talking to Josh a bit about, I don't know who watches The Gilded Age on HBO Max, but there's we were watching with the kids, and it's there's this one episode where they kind of are powering up a building with electricity, and they're like, wow, this is amazing. It's this revolutionary thing, and I think it's important to think about AI in that context. I don't know that you're going to see, it took a long time for electricity to actually power most places in a given city. And AI may or may not be like that. But it's not to say that because you don't see the immediate shifts right away, or you don't see it kind of being mass adopted in a very obvious way, it doesn't mean that there isn't something fundamentally different that's happening that will, over the course of years, lead to significant changes in productivity and wealth generation.
Sean and Amanda, Jordan said something nice about AI. I'm very worried about AI self-esteem after this panel. Is there, for everything we've just said over the past hour, is there anything when you look at government, when you look at the public service, and you say, okay, you know what, actually, AI, there's a spot where AI is going to make a noticeable difference and a better, a good difference? All right, good. No. Well,
I mean, I can think of one use case right now that's underway where I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. The backlog of cases from the Phoenix pay system disaster, which would take decades to go through with humans moving across the various databases that speak to each other to figure out what someone is owed or what they have to pay back. And so this is something that is an appropriate problem to attach AI to. And I think the people who are working on that team have strong digital literacy, and they are managing this project in conformity with a lot of the principles we're talking about. They've created a group of expert stakeholders and observers. I'm one of them. They meet with us every couple of months to talk about how they're developing the program, how they're training staff, what the issues are. And I mean, it's one of these cases where they kind of deeply studied a problem, and then they said, yes, AI is an appropriate tool to solve this problem. And that to me is what we should be doing is sort of figuring, like deeply studying problems and then deciding where AI can be used or not, and doing it in these sorts of accountable ways. I think the other piece as well is like, of course, any knowledge worker, if you have that baseline of expertise, and I think that's a big if, and universities have a role to play here, of course you can use these tools like to augment your work incredibly. I mean, I'm using ChatGPT constantly in my job. But you have to be able to obviously investigate and detect and identify where the issues are. And I think that's where like my mindset is now as someone who's in a program that produces future public servants largely. Many of them are here, my students are here, and we teach in these classrooms in this building. And right now, I'd say from the university perspective, we're kind of underserving governments and all sectors really in training students to be effective consumers and regulators and governors of these technologies. In one study that I contributed to, we looked at sort of the top 100 Masters of Public Administration programs in Europe and the top 100 in the United States, and only one of them had a course on AI ethics. And so all of these programs will produce future managers of public servants and public programs and public services, and yet virtually none of them will have any training in understanding digital technologies and AI and the ethics of governing them. So I think we have quite a lot to do in the university to kind of produce that expertise so that this example that I began with of this sort of HR payment system cleanup can happen, right? Like we need to change what we see as the core competencies of a policy worker today. It's not just law, history, economics. It's like a baseline comfort and eagerness to understand technology in a way that the current fleet of executives in government, I mean, they truly don't have, and they really don't want to touch tech problems because they always end in massive failures. So there's this kind of learned helplessness that is like deeply unaccountable and irresponsible for the senior class of public servants.
I love your optimism on the Phoenix backlog being solved by AI. I've been part of those.
AI can solve our previous screw-ups.
Yeah, anyway, my goodness. We should do a whole lecture on Phoenix. Just on the backlog, I got briefings on that. They showed us what they're going to do, how they're going to throw AI at data sets. And the fear I had, in the way they were briefing us at the time, we, as bargaining agents, we pushed back. It's like, we need comp advisors to look at the data when it comes out. Because garbage in, garbage out, and that's my concern. I think one thing, Aaron, I'll answer your question. I look at our, we represent tax auditors, not the folks that audit us, like our T4s and stuff, but the corporate giants and, the people that make great wealth. That's our members. And the amount of data, you look at the Panama Papers, you look at all this stuff, like we are behind the times. Because the government, in my opinion, and it's true, have not invested in sort of that corporate tax auditing. And we definitely could throw AI at diving into the Panama Papers and popping out, like you said, for the chartered accountants that are our auditors, look at that and find, hopefully the AI can find those juicy bits, and then basically the auditors go after and find out if there actually is gold at the end of the tunnel. So,
I mean, I guess it goes back to the idea that there's someone, to Kevin and Amanda, a couple other people have mentioned this idea that you've got a human somewhere in the process.
Well, no, you need that accountability. And that's, I'll go back to it. So we talked about automated decision-making. The government of Canada already has a policy on automated decision-making. The funny thing is we've actually asked them, what are you using this for? It's been around for a few years. I think what they told us is it's helping picking campsites for Park Canada. That was the example they gave us. I hope that's it, because right now we're not getting that kind of transparency. And my fear too, even with those campsites, is there's a lot of bias in AI. Is it focusing? Is it giving it just to folks in Toronto? Are we going to rural communities? How is the decision being made? Aside from just picking out of a hat, is the AI making this informed decision about who gets a campsite and who is being disadvantaged by it? And we actually don't have those details, even though there is a policy on automated decision making. But I have yet to see the transparency on how it is actually being used to decide, how Canadians live.
Jordan, I hesitate to ask this because we've both seen Parliament in action. Is this a place where Parliament should be exercising far more curiosity?
Yes. Although, and I think it's been remarkable that, there are a few politicians who have been curious and concerned about AI, and actually Michelle Rumpel-Garner is one of them. It's like maybe an unlikely character for this, but it hasn't really been broadly shared. And I think they need to get curious and get concerned and get involved for a few reasons. So first is for to uphold their job as legislators, because there is going to need to be likely updates to legislation and regulation that will flow from these technologies, both for their uses in government, for their uses in elections, and in other spaces. But then the other is the societal impact of broad-based AI adoption. So we're just at the beginning of this, but we can already see that in a time of really high youth unemployment, AI adoption is putting pressure on those entry-level jobs that people used to count on. And for a really long time, people thought that it was going to be blue-collar jobs that were overwhelmingly going to be eliminated by AI. And it is true that we're seeing some of that for sure in the trucking industry, which is really significant. But now a lot of the impact is in the knowledge economy, right? It's lawyers, it's people who code for a living. It's these are the job categories that are going to be really impacted, and all of that comes with really important and significant societal impacts at a time when people are already feeling completely stretched to the brink, as David has talked about. People already feel very precarious. And so this is another form of instability that's coming in our social and economic future. And when you couple that with the risk that AI, if it isn't properly governed, if it isn't properly regulated, and if there isn't that trust and accountability, the damage that it can do to institutional trust, to trust in the ability of government to deliver for citizens, that leads us to some pretty dangerous places. And I'll just observe that one of the leading indicators, if you look back sort of pre-2016 in the US, one of the leading indicators that led up to Trump's election was a massive drop in institutional trust among the US public. So when people feel like they are not being served, broadly speaking, by their political and economic systems, they want to burn them down. And that should be a problem that concerns every party across the board, to make sure that we don't get into that space in Canada.
I want to throw to questions, and I think I'm supposed to by now. Is there anything else anybody wanted to throw on the table before we do so? We've covered a lot of territory. I've lost track of, there we go. So if you have a question, raise your hand. We have a microphone that will be brought to you. Or we've answered all your questions.
Answer them all.
Okay, there we go.
Josh had a question for Zach.
Thanks, folks. Wow. It's a big privilege to be the first person to ask a question, in part because first person to try and take all of that in. I think one of the questions that had been burning in the back of my mind, we've talked a lot about AI at a systemic level, not necessarily as much at a human level, but we know for a fact that politics, at the end of the day, democracy, it is individual human decisions that are going towards, the changes that predicate our future. But something that, was top of mind was that, learning is a critical element to knowing. And to know is to understand. And, when you speak to teachers about what does AI usage look like within the education system, it looks like folks getting the answers before they understand and learn how to get there. And I think that sort of, it showcased itself during the discussion, especially in speaking about the policy analyst who is writing the briefing, or perhaps proof-checking the briefing, or the medical professional who's having their work checked by AI. Well, it may have been in the past that if the doctor was having his work checked, it was by someone who might later be a doctor. And if that work is now being done by AI, what do those systems of learning and knowledge generation that make us humans start to look like in the future? And so bringing it back to a question that's politics-based, a well-informed public is a critical element towards democracy. And so if we're working our way into a world where the general public has a lessened ability to critically understand and know the information that's supposed to be helping them make informed decisions, what does that start to mean about our elections and the issues that it's predicated on and the information level of the general public?
That's an easy one. Anyone want to take it?
I mean,
Kevin, you want to go first?
Well, I just would want to situate it again in the broader context. I tend to be more optimistic about these things, and I just think in the last I don't know, 200 years, we have been, more literate than we have been for the last, million years. And so I do think, like, typically the trend line has been that as technologies, these general purpose technologies, printing press, being one, electricity another, as those things have democratized access to information, it actually has led to a more informed citizenry. So there are obviously many different ways in which one could talk about AI and say, oh, well, maybe it's not the case here. But I don't know. I mean, I think people are generally pretty smart about things. They tend to they're able to sniff out what is true and what isn't true. And I think that hopefully the arc of history will be that as technologies democratize information, people are better for it. As has been the case since, for the last million years, but I think especially since the invention of the printing press.
Jordan, you wanted to know that?
Yeah, I think part of the challenge is the volume of information that's coming at citizens and voters right now, and the volume of other struggles people are dealing with at the same time. So we can have great amounts of factual information available to voters, but at the end of the day, it plays actually a relatively small role in their political decision making. Most political decision making is, as the kids would say, largely on vibes. And that is, I think, to the unending grief of those of us who work in the political policy space. But it is the reality, and that becomes even truer in moments of great economic stress and displacement because everyone's just trying to get by. So we have a challenge in that, yes, maybe educationally, people will not necessarily have the same kind of critical thinking skills that previous generations were trained with because it's also not in the same environment, right? So they are acquiring different skills. But I'm not sure they'll necessarily be inferior skills. They're just going to be different. But I think that the context in which people exercise these skills is actually what we really have to pay attention to. That when we're in a moment of growing inequality, when we're in a moment, for example, when we're seeing like a real bifurcation of our employment market, where you get people who are being, who are very well paid, who are very highly skilled, who are kind of at the top end of the employment market, and you get people who are lower skilled and in precarious and contract work and gig economy and things like that, and very little that's stable in the middle, it is going to be much harder for people in that second group, for example, to be engaging in a really sort of thick way with the political process. And so I would say, yes, AI is maybe a portion of that challenge, but it has to be seen in a broader sort of social and economic context to understand how voters actually take in information and convert it into political decisions.
I might jump in on that. I think this question is great because it speaks to what I think we should be thinking about as part of a broad kind of national AI strategy, which is the implications this has for the education sector more broadly, right? I mean, and here it's important to I think, segment by cohorts. I do worry that the younger cohort of individuals who are growing up with ChatGPT and access to generative AI for their schooling are going to have inferior skills. In as much as, I noted earlier that I use ChatGPT all the time, and part of that is that because I, had much training before it existed, where I was sitting down reading books and reading articles and having to do the kind of traditional learning and analytical thinking that was part of a classic education, right? And so then when you have that training and education and you have done that reading, you're in a better position to identify where there's hallucinations and issues with citations, and you can leverage the tool in ways that lead to better outcomes and good work, frankly, I hope. But if I think now about students that are summarizing articles through generative AI and then writing based on the summary, they've never actually sat down and had to think slowly and consume writing in the way that has traditionally been how we've communicated knowledge. Now, I want to be clear. I think the way we've thought about pedagogy in universities and in elementary and high school as well is certainly not perfect. I mean, this is an opportunity to really ask, how can we do all of this better, and where is the evidence on how people actually learn? And I'm not an educational theorist, but the person who I think is probably saying the smartest things about this right now is a Professor Niall Ferguson, who basically argues that we should have kind of this model of educating people where we cloister them away for 6 to 7 hours a day from AI and force students to like actually engage with their own writing as an intellectual act and others' writing as an intellectual act. And then his second period is the Starship, where you can go to AI and use it for all the things you might want to supplement your learning. And we're not doing that right now, and young people today aren't doing that now, and I fear that what's going to happen is the same way we're now all worried about this lost generation of kids who were raised on smartphones and the anxious generation, and there's this backlash, and we're pulling phones out of kids' hands in high school because the evidence suggests that it causes serious harm to mental health. I think we might face a similar crisis if we don't do the same thing about the use of these tools in education now. And it'll matter for things like how informed we are as voters. It'll also matter for how smart we are as knowledge workers and how human we are as humans, frankly.
Next.
Thank you. I have a general and probably naive question that relates probably more to learning models. And it seems to me that at the moment, these things are successful because they're sort of built on hundreds of years of human experience in learning in areas like science, medicine, and so on, where the vast experience, which is now available online, can be used and synthesized in unique and probably productive ways. But it seems to me that as machines generate more and more of the data that's available, we'll have a situation in the near future where machines will be learning from machines. And this seems to me a system with feedback. And I wonder if any of you have any thoughts or concerns about this.
That sounds like a Jonathan question.
Super briefly, I mean, there are some real technical reasons why this might be a problem, is that it can lead to something called like model collapse, which is you're feeding in what's called essentially synthetic data. It's created by the model itself or similar models and feeds back in and creates this loop where it's not really realistic anymore. And this is a problem with general purpose AI, so the ChatGPT, that type of thing. Where this type of synthetic data can be really helpful actually is, let's think about chess again. How did AlphaGo, which is one of the best chess models out there, get so good? Well, it trained against itself. It played thousands and thousands of games against itself. Essentially, it created its own data, fed off that, and got quite a bit better. So the science is still not clear on how this will work. It's a real risk. Companies are working really, really hard to figure out, now that we've used essentially every speck of data that exists in the world, how do we create more? Part of that is making synthetic data and making it sustainable, but it's really tough to tell.
So I agree with you. I think there are other ways in which AI maybe can actually push the frontiers of scientific discovery. So I was involved with a project on sort of like an open chemistry project where they're actually using our spare capacity when we're not we're not running all the social media platforms, and trying to do computations on what discoveries we can make on polymers, synthetic polymers, that can lead to advances in material science. So I think it does depend. I think there is a theoretical question about whether or not synthetic data is going to kind of limit how far you can get with LLMs, although I think there are different methods to do that we're discovering. But I also think on the other side, there is this huge potential to advance the frontiers of scientific discovery using AI models. That's actually pretty exciting.
Anybody else? At the back.
So we've been talking about text-based generative AI, but I'm also very concerned about images-based AI, such as deepfakes, which is almost not identifiable for the general public as how it advanced to now. And there's a case that Mark Carney was being deepfaked to advise for an investment company called All Real Group. The video was taken down and the government's raised investment warnings for the company, but there's no other criminal charges for them. How do you think this is going to affect our political environment and individual safety?
Jordan?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a new frontier, right? This is now something campaigns have to consider and plan for. What happens if a deep fake of your candidate or your leader comes out? That is part of contingency planning. And the reality is, you're right, is that we actually we're not, as a species and in the public generally, are not necessarily very good at identifying what is fake information and what is real information. Some of it can be very persuasive. And so one of the areas that needs to be developed is better detection of those deep fakes. And ironically, that's where AI can have a role potentially in helping identify those. But there's also, I think, a place for civic education there and for digital literacy, which we've often talked about in social media and political spaces. And that's not to put the obligation just on citizens to be aware of this, but it is to really underline that when we're sharing information online, when we're looking at news stories, to be teaching people to identify credible sourcing, to be looking for clues about things that might not be real information, and to avoid then in turn putting that information back out there through social media. So that's actually something that at an individual citizen level, we can all kind of play a part in. But of course, you're going to need really international action to address some of those questions. And partially that'll be through regulation, partially that'll be through technology adoption. But you are going to see campaigns, I think, increasingly building it into their contingency planning. And I think that it will also, as has been the case with a lot of these things as they've emerged on social media, it'll just become less of a big deal too. If you think about when originally social media was a thing, when we started having candidates who were of an age where most of their life was on social media, like there was a time when somebody's Facebook post from 10 years ago would really be a scandal. Well, that time has passed now because almost all of the political candidates who are running in a given election have had their entire lives online. So the bar for what constitutes a political problem has shifted as that technology has become more widely adopted. And so I think that there will be an element of that as well in this question.
Anybody else?
Hi, so full disclosure, I am a public servant and I work in data and analytics within there. So we prepare and try to get our data ready, and you are right, our data is a mess. Full disclosure, trying to fix it. But you brought up a lot of kind of like public opinion and how they have a lot of distrust, and I think that makes sense. But I find a real disconnect in how fast you're talking about how things are going, but internally in the government, it feels like it's going incredibly slow. Procurement is so slow to the point where it takes like a year to be able to procure a technology service that has already been up, like it's already passed when it was useful. And all the conversations internally are actually that Canada's quite behind, to the point where I can't even use simple services like forms because we have to make sure I'm all for data residency, but I can't compete with, there's a podcast dedicated to how much money that OpenAI and Meta are like competing on salaries for getting each other. Like we can't compete with that. So there's a realistic component of what we can do. And so I'm very cognizant of the risk, but how do we balance? Because as much as the public is like, I want to make sure that I'm concerned about AI, but I also want all of my tools to work like Netflix. And I want you guys to know me in the government as well as Amazon does. And so there's a real balance between how do we meet public expectations and also meeting we have to keep doing more and more and more with less and less and less, and still trying to do things at a quick pace from an IT perspective while managing the slow pace of legislation. I know that's a big question, but it was really, like as a practitioner, it was hard because I was like, it's actually quite slow. We're trying so hard to be able to move forward and really do things correctly and finding the disclaimers and tagging our data as what's AI and really finding what should be part of an AI model and what shouldn't. But I think at the same time, it feels incredibly slow internally. But yeah, sorry, I know it's a big question.
I know it's hard to believe government's slow. Anyone want to Sean, you want to take a shot at that?
Sure, I can try to take a shot at that. And listen, I've worked in the federal government. I know how glacial procurement moves. Actually, our members are purchasers. Some of our members are purchasers. I think, and to speak to your point, I think that our members of the public service are already using those tools. And my fear is they're going to use the tool and to our detriment, to the Canadian detriment, because they're going to put stuff into ChatGPT that probably shouldn't have went there. You know, and there are other controls in place. I would love to work with the government to move quicker on AI to where it makes sense, for sure. You know, and use those tools. You know, you might be one of my members. I don't know for sure, but excellent. Well, thank you. So the fact is that, you know, we have experts sitting in house, and the problem is the government of Canada is not listening to the advice and guidance of their public servants. You know, I hate red tape as much as most Canadians do, but you know, the fact that we're not leveraging you and the work you do internally is such a lost opportunity. And I think that, you know, we're always looking to the outside when we should look inside and build that capacity inside. And so to go back to what I was saying, you know, if you have the ideas and the tools, why is your management not supporting you, giving you potentially that need, that the money? Yeah, it's all about the money. You know, there's lots of money. That's the thing, is the budget talks about constriction, but really they should be, if they're going to invest in AI, it shouldn't be going to an external firm. It should be going into the public service, in my humble opinion. Thanks.
Amanda, did you want to, as someone who's thought a lot about government moving maybe not so fast?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the where I get concerned and confused by the emphasis on AI to find efficiencies, because it's really reducing those internal administrative burdens to free up public servants to be kind of more efficient and productive and boost their morale, frankly, because I think it's pretty demoralizing to have so many approvals and processes to jump through. Like one recent analysis found that a simple 4-page website took more documentation internally than the entire Great Gatsby, word length-wise. So like, there's just like an imbalance, right? And of course, we've been talking a lot about accountability and having more guardrails and checks. So it's not that we want to throw the rules out, but I think there's kind of over-calibrated to like a deep kind of risk-averse mentality that, you know, clearly isn't serving anybody. So I feel your pain. But I do think there's also a huge opportunity right now, given the current government's focus on finding these efficiencies, to kind of get that message up there that there's tons of ways to make the federal public service more productive. And a lot of it is just like reducing the amount of oversight where it's not needed, and then beefing up the oversight on the AI side, as we've discussed, where it is needed.
Just remind your managers that the Prime Minister said we were going to move at speeds we haven't seen in generations.
That is a useful
else?
line in a briefing
I
note.
think he talks about it. Anyway.
Yeah. I don't know where our microphone is.
Neither do I.
Hi, good evening. So it was previously mentioned that institutional trust is a much needed component for a functioning democracy. It's clear that our current government frameworks do not sufficiently govern AI usage to the fullest extent, and that the relationship between AI and governance is now symbiotic, since we're integrating it into our government. So to what extent would you say that our institutions need to evolve to address AI issues such as deepfakes to maintain our trust in them?
Any takers?
You know, I think it really goes back to that, you know, deepfakes, definitely, I'm fearful of deepfakes in the fact that, you know, like, is someone going to be, like, you look at, you know, we talk about deepfakes, you know, today, it's funny because once I got elected president, people are getting emails all the time from me about gift cards and I need to make this payment and stuff like that. My fear is that we're going to see that, we've heard about the grandparent CRA scam. My fear is that the AI is going to get good enough, it's going to sound like a tax auditor from the CRA that's calling you, and that is a real fear. And how are we counteracting that? You know, because, you know, I look at, you know, you never get an email from this person or that person, but if we get to the point where it's mimicking the way the government of Canada actually works, that is fearful, and we need to be transparent about how exactly the government of Canada does work when it does contact a taxpayer. You know, back in the day, if you didn't get a letter from the CRA, it wasn't the CRA. But with AI, I am fearful that they're going to impersonate us, and that is going to cause great harm.
I think we have time for two more questions.
A lot of hands.
Hi, I'm really concerned about human rights and justice, and I'm really concerned about authoritarianism versus democracy and the surveillance state. It seems like AI is like where they all converge. And I would like to know that regulations are going to keep us a democracy, I'd like to know that human rights, both individual and collective, are going to increase rather than decrease. And I feel like we're really in a perilous moment because it's USA and China right now. So I'd really like to see like national policies towards regulation, that we move towards a more just society rather than a less just society. So what part of the AI community is working on that?
Jonathan, that's your job, I think.
Yeah, so I think that's a really great question. I mean, one of the risks with AI and one of the benefits of AI is it can do it at a speed and scale that we've never seen before. That's great for good things, bad for bad things. I know that sounds tautological, but we really have to think about it that way. The good news is that there's an adoption gap for the authoritarians as well, so we haven't seen a ton of really super harmful AI-driven behavior yet. I mean, there's some facial recognition things that are happening. What I would say is that Canada's competitive advantage is that we have a stable government, relatively. We have the rule of law. We have trust in each other. We have a care for communities. We have a care for diversity, all of these types of things that exist here. And those are true of many of our partners in Europe as well. When we talk about this US-China race, these are two countries that I fundamentally don't really trust to, they just don't have the incentives to stop what you're describing. And for me, the only clear solution is actually that Canada and its partners need to catch up at the top level of AI so that we can shape it in a way that reflects our values. We cannot allow ourselves to farm out choices about what's happening in Canada to a small group of people in Silicon Valley or a small group of people in Hangzhou, China. It just doesn't make sense. We need to build the models to reflect our values.
One more?
Hi. As a federal public servant who works in access to information and privacy, so I'm the person who puts the black lines across government secrets.
Thank you.
One of the
Very thorough.
one of the conversations that we're having right now with regards to AI is, like you mentioned, briefing notes earlier, and if you're using those to smooth out sentences or what have you, those briefing notes can occasionally contain cabinet confidences, national security secrets, and we have arguably some, reasonably good laws for privacy protections. However, the servers that are hosting ChatGPT do not have those same privacy requirements. So you can buy the information that is being input into ChatGPT, and so suddenly they have access to our government secrets. Are there conversations and discussions being had right now about the impact on future privacy breaches because of AI?
Well, I can answer part of it or try to answer part of it. Others should weigh in. I mean, I agree with you that you definitely shouldn't be putting classified information into a
100%.
open kind of chatbot. Like for sure not. I agree with you. Although I think, the departments will have particular guidance, but that just sounds dicey. I think that brings me back to like what I was talking about earlier, which is like similar to a hospital in a way, right? It's like you want to be, ideally for some of the most sensitive information, you actually do want to, whatever AI thing you want to accomplish, you probably want to do it what is in the lingo is called on-prem, right? So like on-premise, you want to keep the server, kind of local, and you don't want to be sending things outside of, the jurisdiction that governs the security of the data you're kind of handling. So I think there are solutions, but people have to be, I think, prepared to think about things in that way and make sure that they have the right infrastructure and the right technical know-how to keep it localized.
Yeah, I don't know if those discussions. I eventually made to be a cybersecurity person. I don't work with CSIS or CSE. I hope, and we don't know because it's secret, but I hope that they are building their in-house AIs. I don't know if they are or not. But the government of Canada, and we've been advocating constantly to the government of Canada, you need to be building this in-house for that reason right there alone, because I do have a great fear that there's government secrets already in these systems. I hope I'm wrong. I really hope I'm wrong. But if we're not careful, the ATIP is going to be useless because the documents are going to be sitting in a ChatGPT server and potentially accessed by an authoritarian regime. So.
It sounds like you're giving me a way around ATIPs, and I'm interested in that. But that's good. I won't take advantage.
We'll share some data there.
Yeah, thanks.
You should actually ask ChatGPT, like, what can you tell me about this particular document in the government?
It's interesting. This is all coming together now.
Yes, there you go.
Thanks, everybody. That was really great. I appreciated it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was incredible. And I mean, thank you so much, Aaron, for moderating that. That was an expert job. I mean, like, this panel is so diverse in terms of its experience. Really takes a pro to get so much information out. Thank you very much, Sean, to Jordan, Amanda, thank you, Jonathan, and Kevin. I'm really happy that we recorded this so we can all watch it again, because there's a lot of content there that I know people are wanting to get back to. You know, it's interesting within that conversation, we have a minister in charge of artificial intelligence. And we hear from the Prime Minister, and we just saw in the budget, that we're moving forward, but we're not seeing the regulation beforehand. And it's really helpful to know that that is top of mind for all of you who work in that industry, who work for the government, and those of you who hold the government to account, that you're on top of it for all of our sakes. I would say that we had a good look at the ghost in the machine tonight. And so thank you all for being here, for those of you online. I have some thank yous that I want to make, but first I want to talk about one more thing. Did everybody here have a good time and enjoy themselves? Let's get a round of applause for... Great. I'm very happy to hear that, because thousands of other people have experienced similar events across this country this year. Next year, I'm proud to announce that the Douglas Caldwell-Leighton Foundation will increase our lecture series from 6 to 8 events in 8 different cities in partnership with 8 universities. To bring this kind of quality educational content to people across this country, and no matter where you live, you can access it online. So with that said, I invite you to take that card of yours and flip it over and get to know the foundation so that you don't miss any of the quality programming that we put on throughout next year. I have some thank yous that I need to make. Right out of the gate, I want to thank Jennifer Robson. Thank you so much for your partnership. It's meant a lot. This is the second year now that we've been here at Carleton, and the second year that we've had a sold-out audience, crowd, and a really dynamic panel. I'm looking forward to next year's event. I'd also like to thank Cora St. Pierre Jones. You really are a fantastic administrator, and you made my job so much easier, and you're standing beside the other. Yeah. And Casey Larocque, our event organizer at the DCLF. Thank you so much, Casey, for all of your help. Now, none of us would be here if it weren't for the very generous support of our sponsors and our partners. So those are the organizations who throughout the year fund our work. So I'd like to say thank you to the United Steelworkers, AMAPSIO, PIPS, the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada, Goldblatt Partners, UFCW Canada, NUPG, the Canadian Teachers Federation, and the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario. Those are our annual partners who fund all of our work and make it possible for us to travel across the country for this level of education. So thank you all for making that possible. Lastly, to each and every one of you, thank you for being here and supporting this foundation and this work. And I will say one last thing about the MPM program. It really is the best political management program in any school across our country. I know myself and other persons have had the great pleasure of bringing new team members into our organizations thanks to the preparedness that your program brings to us. So thank you for that. With that, folks, please stick around. The conversation isn't going to end. We have drinks, we have food, so please join us. Let's keep the conversation going tonight. Take care. Thank you.
Hamburg. I mean, it's one of the no, it's an early theory about what can happen. There's some evidence that we have to think about how do we trust AI in the same way that they came up with the 3 laws to try to trust AI. They actually came up with the 4th one called the 0 after. It's an always evolving difficult. There's a book called The Alignment Problem. Brian Alton, oh, cool.
I enjoyed your work.
It's a great book. There you go. So are you graduating? Oh, yeah. It's part of the way they were training. It's a really great
No, I'm basically here, but yeah, but my
Well, that's what you asked. Again, like I don't know how much money the government will save, but I think it's like one of those things that will be helpful to governments. Well, I think it's valuable to you. I mean, in terms of the government, it's like, are they like saving millions of dollars? Probably not, but what they're doing is making it available to people.
Well, it's so you need less people to.
Oh, I see. Yes, yes.
But, well, you mentioned from open weight policy.
Is there something powered by lawmakers?
It could be. That's
What are you using?
we're using possibly by designing interoperable. Like, you switch it out. Well, like, if someone can deploy it on Azure or
Why?
Because it's open Microsoft.
I don't know for sure. It's totally. Before AI was my sense is that what I heard they have like some kind of like platform internally where they have like a chatbot and then you can actually the person who goes there can actually switch the model they want to use. But because of the flags next to the model. So like OpenAI, they have like ChatGPT, they have like an American flag. And next to Llama, apparently they have a Canadian flag.
because they're hosting locally, the data doesn't go anywhere, it stays on premise, and so for them it's a native solution. When we're talking, I didn't want to save no, but that's what I understand. Like they're looking for ways to adopt other technology for us, but
Your last answer was good. Tells people that it's possible to start building them, but they don't say, they just say things on it. In my opinion.
If you're seriously saying we're going to make our own model, our own infrastructure, host in our own cloud, and then service 40 plus million people, I think that's particular. But I don't think, I think there's some borders where people have to fully